Before he was hailed as the man who revolutionized interstellar travel, Albrecht Entrati was a subject of ridicule within the Empire. The Void had been discovered, but was known to be exactly as its name implied: nothing. A pocket dimension without form or function. A curious technological dead end with no potential. But Albrecht was determined to find more within the nothingness, and his stalwart insistence to uncover that potential tarnished his reputation until his once promising theories were made as mockery, and he was left only with his closest adherents. His daughter Eularia and ardent assistant Lloyd. At this point in his life, Albrecht and Eularia's mother had since parted ways. Little is known of her, but in her absence, Albrecht raised Eularia with detachment, marking the beginning of a long and complicated familial relationship. Among his assistants, Lloyd had remained by his side even as he became ridiculed by the onlookers who attended his frequent void dives, and his service persisted against any hardships. In later years, he would even go so far as to fight against agents sent by Parvos Granum when Granum began to take an interest in the Void and the Spectre particles, determined to take his share of the monopoly on void science that the Entrati would later wield. Both Lloyd and Eularia had a deep respect, veneration, and love for Albrecht, though with his cold demeanor and unrelenting pursuit of further horizons, Albrecht did little to return their affections. On one day, Albrecht's routine dive into the Void was met with catastrophe, and when his secure diving bell shattered on the edge between dimensions, he was cast unshielded into the Void. There, he awoke something that had not yet existed. By introducing thought, memory, form, and emotion into the Void, it awoke. It became, thrust suddenly into being by the catalyst of Albrecht's existence. It mimicked the first thing it had ever known, and it hungered for more. As the Void began to copy Albrecht's form and draw forth his senses and memories, Albrecht used the last vestiges of his will to return to the world of dust and warned his lab attendants with a message written in blood, to close the Void and lock out the beast he had awoken. Albrecht survived, but not without loss. His vision, voice, and sanity were destroyed. In desperation, Lloyd nursed Albrecht back to health, repairing the physical damages dealt by the Void exposure and Albrecht's own maddened self-destruction. The healing process took a great deal of time, and is a potential reason why the Albrecht we know now is no longer the familiar blue hue of Orokin Elite, forced to literally grow new skin as he recovered from his encounter with the Indifference. Though another more mundane possibility is that being his final continuity vessel, it had not yet been long enough for the weathering of time to render it in royal blues. Alternatively, after his eventual rise to fame, the Orokins simply rendered him with blue skin in portraits to maintain an image of their elites, not wanting a man wearing the skin of the commoners to appear in any depiction that counted him among their divine rank. Regardless, during the healing process, Albrecht had time to reflect. At first, the trauma from the experience sent him into a deep existential dread, and he felt a nagging desire to simply give up and let death take him. But eventually, his own self-loathing drove him from his healing womb and into the waiting arms of Lloyd. The selfless love and care that Lloyd provided during his recovery imprinted deeply upon Albrecht in his weakened and fragile state, and Albrecht fell in love with Lloyd in turn. Inspired to live, Albrecht reflected on what he had seen, what he had done. Fearful that he may simply be his own reflection lost in the struggle beyond the wall, he resolved to fight back against what he had unleashed, what he had created. He would find a way to close the door, banish the Indifference for good, and prove through his actions that he was himself. As Albrecht sought to understand his foe, he realized that he had locked the Indifference into a position that it could not easily escape from. In his struggle with the Void, one of its fingers had been cut by the closing of the untimed door. That finger then became crucial in Void travel, using a fragment of the Void itself to traverse its waters, acting as beacon, anchor, and compass. By using the severed finger and later copies or quantum-entangled duplicates, depending on your interpretation, travel across space was revolutionized. Orokin towers were scattered throughout the Void, serving as secure travel vessels, vaults, battle platforms, or whatever other purpose the Empire could use them for. Positions coordinating to real space were marked with Entrati lanterns, allowing for safe and accurate travel between the world of dust and dreams. No longer was the Orokin Empire tethered to the system of Sol, and it was all due to the single piece of an eldritch god that Albrecht had lured across the threshold. But more than advancements to the Empire were brought with the reliquary. The Void's finger had been caught in a snare formed from the strand of Kra itself. Kra, meaning time. The exact functions of time are still a bit hazy in the Warframe universe, but let me give a brief summary of how I currently understand it. The strand of Kra represents a conceptually embodied timeline in the Void, the timeline that we follow, linear and singular. However, while it is narrow, it is also deep. Upon the singular strand of Kra, alternate possibilities, just as real as the one taken, are also manifest, as stated by the theory of eternalism. In metaphorical terms, our space-time is dictated by a single rope representing our timeline, our strand of Kra, but the individual fibers of paths not taken are woven together and made manifest or relegated to the unreal along the rope's length. And as stated in the palimpsest of space-time, where the fibers cross over each other, the paths beneath are not removed, they are merely hidden within the greater rope of time, capable of being unwoven and revealed, or for further fibers to be rewoven atop the singular path. And while complicated, for the Void, that rope still serves as a snare, with part of its form locked into a singular timeline in the world of dust, one that adheres to at least some measure of reason. Albrecht was able to maneuver around the Indifference and plot to defeat it. With its finger serving as the anchor, the Void is only able to manifest a single strand of Kra tethered to the end point of its severed finger, and must follow its length to encroach upon our world. Essentially, it weaves strands by simulating cause and effect until one such series of simulated events reaches an endpoint near our current location in time, where it can then be tethered by one of its heralds into our reality. The Void's true power is restricted to a single, narrow pathway, though its ability is monstrous still. Should the Void ever untether itself from our linear reality, it would be free to manipulate across realities and timelines, weaving strands of Kra in all directions and enacting effect without needing to adhere to cause, and unfathomable ruin would come to pass. No longer tied with a single rope, but crawling upon an entire web, free to travel and manipulate as it sees fit. And the longer Albrecht took to undo his mistake, the more the Indifference began to burrow through the wall of Loke to recover what it had lost. In an effort to at least slow the Void, Albrecht enacted a gambit based on a simple principle. If the Void copied what it encountered, then why not let it copy a lesser form, one of a simple animal? Albrecht then devised the Cavia, or guinea pigs as their name means. Albrecht threw hundreds of creatures into the hungry maw of the Void, hoping the Void would imprint on their simple minds and become weaker, but all the Cavia returned dead, destroyed by the Indifference within. Frustrated, Albrecht searched for answers as to why the Void would not take his sacrifices. While imbibing in Nestawood with Lloyd, Albrecht came to a sudden conclusion. It was not a matter of the animals lacking an aura or soul, but one of simple interest. The Indifference, living up to its namesake, simply did not care enough about the simple-minded beasts Albrecht was sending across the fold. It rejected them as a child might reject an unwanted toy. So, Albrecht resolved to provide it with an offering worthy of its attention and, hopefully, its mimicry. While Albrecht believed that his beloved Kavat Kalymos would possess enough of a semblant sapience to draw the Void's attention, he refused to sacrifice one of the few things he truly cared about. Instead, with Lloyd's assistance, Albrecht secured the last two breeding Servilites, something truly rare and unique, hoping that the Void would be drawn to the bait. To add to the offering, Albrecht arbitrarily added a bird from the jungles of Earth and a Norg to serve as mental ballast, having just enough intelligence that it may lure the Void's eyes to the rest of the prize. The beasts, like all others prior, were expendable. They had no distinction, no names, no import. Had their voyage failed like all the others, Albrecht would have merely moved on to a different configuration of sacrifices and continued his dire work. The Norg had no name, a last-minute addition to increase the chances of the Void locking onto its minimal intellect. The bird, simply Bird 3, likely a remaining subject from a previous batch of similar sacrifices, added almost on a whim to achieve, as Albrecht himself put it, only a facile equilibrium of land, sea, and air. And of course, the Servilites, secured exclusively to be cast into the Void, not even worthy of a batch distinction like the bird, marked immediately and simply as tag for disposal. And when this group of creatures was submerged into the depths of the void, to Albrecht's credit, they did draw its eye, but not for the reason Albrecht had hoped. The bell to protect the specimens was penetrated, and they were fully at the void's mercy. The void imparted full sapience onto the creatures, cursing them with the sudden understanding of life and the crushing terror that theirs was about to end. The sudden horror of comprehension, of realizing how small they were, was enough to throw the beasts into a frenzy. The Norg, reacting first, likely due to its small initial intelligence advantage, panicked and sought to escape this predator that had entered their cage. Thinking only to preserve the sudden sense of self it had gained, the Norg blew the containment seals of their bell, venting the interior and flooding it with void energy. The sudden vacuum pulled the female Serviolite into the nothing, and she was lost to the void. Before the void could harm them further, the bell was recalled, but the damage had been done. The surviving creatures were poisoned by the void, doomed to a slow, inevitable death from exposure. But more than that, the gift of the void returned with them. What the void had given them was understanding, sense of self, and speech. But the only language it had imparted was its native tongue, the void tongue, incomprehensible to the world of dust. It sent its pilgrims back across the threshold of the untimed door with a message they could never convey, and the agony of knowing that they could never convey it. When Albrecht saw them return alive, agonized, suffering from the sudden burden of intelligence, he was horrified. Not only at what the void had done, but what he had done. He realized that the void was no longer some simple mimic. It was not rejecting the Cavia due to some arbitrary configuration Albrecht had not found. It was rejecting them because it wanted him. Albrecht was overcome with guilt, and the Cavia project ceased. Though Albrecht should have put the beasts out of their misery and prevent void contamination from spreading through the labs, he relented. For one reason, out of a hope that one day the void tongue would be understood and the messages of the Cavia heard. But he also spared them out of pity. He could not bring himself to kill the only creatures to have survived his callous experiments. Unable to look upon them, to reckon with the living examples of his cruelty and failure, Albrecht assigned their hospice care to Lloyd. Though doomed to die, Lloyd, of his own volition, sought a way to cure the void's exposure, as both a way to preserve another of Albrecht's legacies and to take Albrecht's atonement upon himself. While ultimately deemed as failures of their original purpose, the Cavia were not Albrecht's only plans to fight back against the Indifference. Being a man of many possibilities, Albrecht explored numerous avenues of combat. One such potential front was in the kingdom of Duviri. But before discussing Albrecht's time in Duviri, it is important to give a bit more context regarding his familial relationships, especially with his daughter Eularia. As mentioned earlier, Albrecht had always had difficulty in raising Eularia, and as his family grew, he dedicated little time to strengthening his relationship with them. In fact, speaking to the members of the Entrati, it seems that much of the time Lloyd cared for the family in Albrecht's stead. Much of Camaros and Kayleigh's upbringing was spent with Lloyd, and he served equal parts butler, mentor, and advisor for the family as they grew. So spread thin was Lloyd between caring for the family and serving as Albrecht's other half that Albrecht saw fit to create an aide for him. In his cold and pragmatic manner, Albrecht decided that the best way to assist a Lloyd who was spread too thin was to create another Lloyd. Not a cephalon, which involves a digitization of consciousness, a transference that destroys the prior vessel, but a construct, a copy. To Albrecht, this made perfect sense, utterly incapable as he was of comprehending why the action might insult or disgust the family and Lloyd himself. Lloyd's contempt towards his hollow copy is clear, even years later when he is woken during the Kalymos sequence. As Albrecht dedicated more time to his study of the void and methods on how to combat the Indifference, the gulf between him and his daughter grew. Soon, to Albrecht, his family became nothing more than tenants at worst, or useful pawns in greater schemes at best. Not wanting to involve the familial strangers who lived within his labs, he created the Sanctum Anatomica below the Necrolisk, secret to all except for Lloyd and himself. Whether it was an action of utter disregard, distrust, or perhaps a misguided attempt to shield his family from his actions, he excised them from his life completely as he continued his work. As the labs beneath Deimos burrowed further and further into the core of the moon, the distance between him and his family became both literal and metaphorical. But Eularia never faltered in her dedication to her distant father. To her, Albrecht was the pinnacle of everything she aspired to be, the consummate scientist and intellectual. So focused was she on following in her father's footsteps that she would head down the same dark path and would become distant from her own husband and children, dragged further and further away from them by the monolithic status of her father's legacy. She would continue to yearn for his acceptance, his recognition, and in her pursuit would become a respected luminary in her own right. But it was not enough for Eularia, and she would still yearn for Albrecht's approval even beyond the ego death brought upon her when the necrolis was exposed to the infestation. But try as Albrecht might to escape the reminder of his failings as a father, as he explored the void for answers, he would inevitably come face to face with his daughter's legacy. Though it isn't specified exactly how or when, at some point, Albrecht would be a visitor to Duviri. In that twisted place, he would be forced to reckon with the world his daughter had created, and the facsimile of her teachings as rendered by the mad child king. The echoes of the Drifter's time aboard the Zeramin would ring out across Duviri, lessons dictated by recordings of Eularia remembered, and the tales of Duviri read in her voice and played across the kingdom with the beginning of each spiral. Every day, Albrecht would be forced to face his failings as a father, and this constant reminder served to inspire both pride in his daughter's work and resolve in how he could learn from her example. At first, Albrecht had sought only to serve as a teacher or advisor to the tyrant king, to warn him of the dangers lurking in the waters beyond his fragile shores. But as time passed, he began to see purpose in Eularia's creations. In the citizens and teachings of Duviri, he saw the fragments of characters he had created for her in her youth, preserved as precious things, worthy of being retold. But more than that, they had been remade as tools of teaching, of healing. Albrecht's actions against the Indifference had been ones of a defensive response, of a way to escape the horror or to shut it away in the hellscape it was born of. But Eularia took a different approach. She sought to advise even the children, the weakest and most vulnerable, and provide them with the tools not just to defend against the Indifference, but to strike back against it. In the light of Eularia's resolve, Albrecht saw Duviri in a different shape, not of a vulnerable breach upon the wall to be protected, but a stronghold, a beachhead to fight against its unending tide. Albrecht spoke to all across Duviri, teaching them of the horrors beyond the borders, and ingraining his teachings so deep that no spiral could ever erase them. He provided Duviri with the faintest of hopes that the tide could not only be endured, it could be repelled. And Duviri in turn gave Albrecht a gift. In the good his daughter had done in his absence, the kindness and protection she sought to foster, Albrecht had been shamed into reevaluating his own reactions, and from that perspective, he saw a different path. No longer did Albrecht plan to poison the void with animal sacrifice, or to shutter the doors and ignore the voice from beyond the walls. He would take action. Albrecht, too, would find a way to take offense against the monster he had created. He delved into the depths of the void and sought to understand its weakness. His grimoire, formed of his findings and understandings, became a catalyst of his work, and soon it took on a life of its own, a conduit for the words of ruin that the void tongue intoned, and capable of inflicting the bearer's will upon reality to some extent. As we see later when we wield the book ourselves, the grimoire is not a one-way door for the void's influence. As Albrecht filled it with more and more eldritch knowledge, it began to act as a conduit for the void itself. Like the Necroloid says, the book is capable of reading its reader, and the surface of the void reflects the bearer like a mirror, projecting a twisted semblance back into our world. For Albrecht, the reflection was likely self-doubt and guilt, literal whispers that sought to drive him to madness. But as the Tenno are beings of the void themselves, the reflection we create is far more powerful and violent. Through arcane and inscrutable research, Albrecht discovered the key to defeating the Indifference lay further back along the strand of Kra, back in the year of the Great Plague, back in 1999. What exactly the key that Albrecht discovered in 1999 is, has yet to be revealed, but it is something that not only would assist in defeating the Indifference, but is something so critical that Albrecht believes even the year itself would be difficult for the Indifference to return to upon the strand of Kra. Not merely due to it existing prior to when the Indifference was unleashed into our reality, but due to some factor only Albrecht is privy to, some crucial nexus of events beyond time and space that made the very year itself anathema to the Indifference. Later, I'll offer some more theories about the 1999 Albrecht visits, but to avoid derailing the video entirely, I'll continue for now. In 1999, Albrecht walked through the events of the Great Plague as a healer. He offered those in the early stages of infestation a chance at salvation through the use of the Helminth strain he brought back from the age of the Orokin Empire. Though ostensibly volunteers, the alternative choice was agonizing death, so few rejected his offer. In those he saved, Albrecht was able to rein the technocyte into malleable form. Copying the works of Ballas, he turned the plague-afflicted into partial, primitive Warframes, still with free will and capable of protecting him from the dangers of the plague year, and also serving as potential void-attuned subjects for further uses. And as he rallied a small group of defenders from the infected, he formulated the idea for the vessels. As Lloyd pointed out, the samples from the afflicted humans that Albrecht returned with bore striking similarity to the Grey strain of the Empire era, a strain known for its ability to mutate flesh into titanic proportion. Albrecht took these samples and carefully cultivated a Grey strain that would follow a blueprint mimicking the precise anatomical perfection of Ballas's Warframes and serve as monstrous bulwarks to fight against the indifferent tide. Most critically, the vessels were also formed from the neural template, the humanity of a man Albrecht worked with in 1999, Arthur. This template serves as the neural link for future operators to interface with the vessels, as without it they would merely be linking to titanic lumps of void conductive flesh in human shape. With Arthur's humanity as a baseline, they could be controlled. It is also possible that Albrecht took other templates for his vessels, perhaps using the woman Aoi from 99 as the template for the female vessels, though that is entirely conjecture. But as Albrecht searched for the key to defeating the Indifference in 99, his time in the present began to run out. The Indifference slowly began to eat away at the walls of reality in his labs. With each journey back along the Strand of Craw, he left a cut for the Indifference to whisper words of undoing into our world, and the walls began to fray, rendered into dust unlike any found in the waking world, a mockery of our plane's namesake. He protected as much of his works as he could and created the Netra cells, Netra meaning decay, a name with a double meaning, serving to both protect against the decay of the murmur assaulting the labs, but to also contain the decay of what Albrecht kept inside. Bits and pieces of the conceptually embodied plague gear ferried back across real space and hidden away for later use. Lloyd installed monitoring systems formed of the void-attuned Grey strain, literal eyes and ears, to monitor for void incursions within the lab and secure the perimeter as best as he was able to buy more time for Albrecht. Outside the labs, the old war was at its height, and inside the labs, the murmur had bypassed most of the lab's defenses. The Necromech armada that was once designed to defend against the Indifference had been turned to its uses, as the simple robotics were no longer able to tell between their master of flesh and blood and the eldritch abomination that mimicked him. The assault was slow and methodical, but the safeguards to halt the approach of the Indifference had been defeated, and nothing remained to stop the flood. Albrecht's pursuer was at the door, and with no other place to hide, Albrecht retreated to the one place he believed the Indifference could not follow. The year of its undoing, 1999. Albrecht enacted the Kalymos sequence, named after his favorite pet. He would retreat to 1999 beyond the reach of the Indifference and await a chosen operator to receive his instructions from his place of refuge along the Strand of Craw. Then, with Lloyd and a host of qualified assistants, they would reactivate the vessels and fight back against the encroaching murmur with an army of titans. With Lloyd's assistance, Albrecht transferred himself and Kalymos once more into the plague gear, and Lloyd severed his tether by destroying the body he left behind. With no place to return, Albrecht was locked into his position on the Strand of Craw. Forced into becoming the hand to kill his beloved and cast his mind into unreachable space, Lloyd was devastated. Albrecht left for him a final message in his grimoire, but Lloyd could not bear to hear the excuses he had grown so familiar to hearing, to hear why his beloved was able to so easily abandon him instead of staying to fight by his side. The years of pursuit towards defeating the Indifference had placed strain on their relationship, and Albrecht's poor emotional sensitivities did little to assist. In rage and grief, Lloyd tore the final page from Albrecht's grimoire and hid it deep within the labs. He would keep Albrecht's instructions intact, but he refused to hear his justifications. Lloyd then placed the lab into lockdown, himself and the Cavia into stasis, and awaited the savior that Albrecht had foreseen. With Albrecht and Lloyd gone, the Grey strain broke through containment and overcame Deimos. Though the family above survived for a time, they would eventually be forced to retreat into the void as the old war raged around them, and in that secluded space, they would meet their own dire fate, but their tale is for another time. Centuries later, after the events on Deimos and with the family, the Kalymos sequence reactivates. An ancient precept within the Necroloid is activated, and the Tenno is called back to the labs. As the first step of the sequence dictates, they awaken the sleeper, Lloyd, to assist in carrying out the rest of the plan. But it had been longer than Lloyd anticipated. He expected a temporary stasis, as he is briefly under the impression that the old war is still active. In the time between sleep and wake, the murmur continued to eat through the walls. The simple salt circles of binding void sigils no longer enough to halt the greater manifestations or deter horrors from the deep void, and the labs fell to its entropic touch. Lloyd enacts the next step of the Kalymos sequence, awakening the vessels in preparation for battle against the Indifference. But it seems that the entirety of the Kalymos sequence was not relayed to Lloyd, for instead of merely awakening the vessels, the operator is transferred along the strand of Craw to the original source of the vessel's template, back to 99, and back to Arthur. In a similar situation to Umbra, the humanity remaining within the vessels was enough to hijack the Tenno's transference, and they were drawn back by the pull of the vessel's emotions and memories, and returned to a moment of desperation in Arthur's placement on the strand of Craw. Fighting to maintain control, Arthur is able to hold the Tenno from his vantage for a time. And from this vantage, Albrecht attempts to relay his instructions to the chosen operator. But Albrecht's plan to escape the Indifference failed. He was followed, and right at the crucial moment of revelation, the void takes over and severs the transference link, sending the Tenno's consciousness back to their broadcast point on the strand of Craw. The void is aware of Albrecht's plan and seeks to disrupt it however it is able. Forced back into the present, the murmur's assault intensifies, and Lloyd calls upon the Tenno to fight against it. But for all the Tenno's might, the murmur can only be slowed, not stopped entirely. The Indifference discovers scattered vessels throughout the labs, and as the vessels are attuned to the void, threatens its ability to control them. Lloyd sends the Tenno into a Netracell to recover an ancient computer part from 99 to fix the overloaded systems that monitor the Tenno's transference into the vessel. In the transference buffer, Lloyd is able to glean the final message that the void attempted to prevent us from hearing. Albrecht attempted to offer a message of apology towards Lloyd, a justification for his actions, explaining that his abandonment was only out of protection. But beyond the personal message, Albrecht left more instructions on how to carry out the sequence and find him once more in 1999, to be facilitated with a strange design for an item formed in amalgam semblance of the Cavia, the Jahu gargoyle, with Jahu meaning form. The gargoyle, as its name implies, brings form to the formless. It turns the void tongue, the language of the unreal, of dreams, into understandable speech of our world, and at last the Cavia speak to us. While Lloyd had expected trained assistants or lab technicians to assist with the Kalymos sequence, the Cavia instead take it upon themselves to act. For the Jahu gargoyle also imprinted the current status of the labs, instructions of the sequence, and Albrecht's disappearance onto the Cavia. Once again, Albrecht's forethought is revealed. His hope for the chosen operator to understand the Cavia more than just a future wish as Lloyd had thought, but instead a direct design. After all, the name of the sequence itself is a clue, named after his beloved pet, and Albrecht was a man of many contingencies. Though initially untrustworthy of the once void-struck creatures, Lloyd has no choice but to follow with Albrecht's plans, forever at the mercy of his impeccable planning. The Norg, calling himself Fibonacci, reveals that Lloyd's emotional outburst and hiding of the final grimoire page prevents the next step of the sequence from being carried out. The grimoire must be intact to properly summon a herald of the deep void, a fragmented one, which must then be defeated to halt the advance of the Indifference. Desperate, though feigning its classic aloofness, the void attempts to leverage the Tenno's bargain and keep the final page hidden, forever preventing the destruction of its fragmented herald. Refusing, our Tenno enrages the void, and as we attempt to return to the Sanctum Anatomica, the void redirects our transference streams once again to displace us. With us delayed, the void hijacks a vessel and prepares a final assault to destroy the lab, retake the Cavia's speech, and prevent the sequence from being completed. Furious, it speaks to us in the void tongue, a phrase that it has repeated numerous times. First, when it revealed itself to us aboard Pregasa, and now written into readable form through subtitles. Vul ni zata vok, Mara lok. While zata, truth, and lok, void, are known, the rest of the phrase is uncertain, with one exception. Both the void and the Cavia have said the same pairing of words before, and it has even been written in the Duviri tablets when posing a question. Mara lok. Always formatted in a way where it seems to be addressing a subject. Us. Digital Extremes has stated that internally, the operator is referred to as Mara, and it seems that this has become officially canon in-game. Mara may mean child, demon, orphan, or any other direct translation that the Tenno have been referred to as in the past, but regardless of the specific translation, it is clear that Mara Lok is how the Void refers to us directly. Void Orphan, Child of the Void, Void Demon, Mara Lok. With that in mind, the Void is likely demanding some sort of truth from us, but what truth it could be is mostly speculation at this point. Pulling itself along the strand of Kra, the Void manifests its Herald of Destruction, and only by using the Grimoire's full power, rendered by the Jahu Gargoyle, can we hope to defeat it, to give form to the formless. Either by consequence or direct design, this also reads Albrecht's final lamentations aloud to Lloyd, his final apologies for the words he never said, the love he was never able to properly convey. One interpretation is that this display of emotion, the love that Albrecht reminds Lloyd of, is the key to stopping the indifference. A commonly cited quote by author Elie Wiesel is the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. And by breaking down the walls of sorrow and indifference that Lloyd himself has created, the murmur can be repelled. Regardless if this is the direct reason or not, the Jahu Gargoyle does its work, and the fragmented one is made vulnerable. Though its herald is defeated, the Void is not deterred. With the last of its strength, it attempts to seize our Tenno, either to gain final purchase and collect what it is owed, or simply out of anger. Our Tenno reacts by transferring into the dormant vessel within the sanctum once more, and moves to intercept. But rather than a strike or display of disruptive power, our Tenno offers a gentle touch to the indifference, one that mirrors the final display of love that Albrecht gave to Lloyd before being sent into the past for the final time. And again, much like in the sacrifice, our Tenno displays their true power, their ability to see inside an ugly, broken thing and take away its pain. The gesture is enough to dispel the final defenses of the indifference, unable to render the cause and effect in a manner that results in the act of kindness displayed by the Tenno, unable to comprehend it, the Void is halted. The strand of Kra it had followed to this point, severed, and its reaching grasp repelled back into the deep void, where it must begin to weave another attack anew. Though the indifference directly was banished for a time, its power lingers. The murmur continues to encroach, though with less strength and intent for a time. The battle is won, but the war rages on. From here, Lloyd agrees to continue working with the Cavia, enacting the final stages of the Kalymos sequence, to repair and rebuild. With the Tenno's assistance, Lloyd and the Cavia continue to repel the threat, and Fibonacci declares himself leader of the trio, though he also cautions the others, specifically Tagver, on carrying the past with them, urging them to move forward with enacting Albrecht's plans unburdened by the horrors that befell them before, though he remains vague on the specifics. The Tenno work in defeating the Murmur in the labs, and we gain a slight understanding of their nature. One element of the ongoing void encroachment are the Lok surges, embodiments of the void that seep into our reality, as seen on the Zeramin due to it also residing on a border between dimensions. Though simply markers of the void's touch to most, the Tenno, being orphans of the void, are able to bend the surges to their will against their source. We also learn that the Murmur and the Indifference itself have taken a keen interest in alchemy, in the fundamental forces that drive the world of dust. Being from a space that adheres to no physical laws, the Indifference seeks to understand our world and its mechanics. These same mechanics of alchemy were utilized by Albrecht to halt and bind the Indifference. Vitriol, the archaic alchemical term for acid, is frequent throughout the labs. Necrocoils, to bind void energy that had been converted into more mundane forces. Salt circles used to bind void manifestations, and as seen by the alchemical symbols in Albrecht's lab notes, alchemy is involved in the specifics as to why 1999 is such a crucial year in defeating the Indifference. The Void likely seeks to understand alchemy in an effort to protect itself, to understand the vulnerabilities it now possesses after being beached upon the shores of the world of dust. But as the Tenno worked to fight against the threat, the relationships between the Cavia began to weaken. Tagfer, still racked with grief over the death of his mate, withdraws from the others and begins to turn towards vengeance. At first, vengeance towards his captor and would-be executioner, Albrecht. He sends the Tenno to ravage the remaining Netricels, searching for secrets that might lead to an upper hand against Albrecht should he ever return. In the Netricels, the Tenno discover valuable resources, but also Archon shards looted from the battlefields of the Old War. When Era's Archons were defeated, the Orokin would send the harvested shards to the Entradi for study, hoping to gain insight into their power. Eventually, Tagfer's fury goes beyond the man who placed him into the bell, and he begins to focus on the one who directly led to the death of his mate. He begins to direct his rage towards Fibonacci. In an outburst, Tagfer nearly shatters Fibonacci's tank, but Lloyd intervenes. Tagfer reveals to Lloyd and the Tenno the truth of what occurred in the bell, how he gained his namesake from his dismissive tag for disposal notation, and how he chose a name, Min, for his mate, to dignify her memory with a title that Albrecht never bothered to provide. A tenuous truce is mediated by Lloyd, and Tagfer places his hatred towards Fibonacci aside in favor of pursuing his revenge against Albrecht. The stress causes Bird 3 to break his normally positive demeanor, and he forces the group to reflect on their actions after being given the Curse of Intelligence. Though fratricide is narrowly avoided, the mental toll and trauma from the experience continues to weigh on the Cavia, and the state of affairs is only worsened when Lloyd has no choice but to reveal to the group that they are doomed to die. Since their reawakening, the health of the Cavia has declined, and the physical ramifications become obvious to them all, and Lloyd can no longer hide the truth. The Void's exposure was too much, and while the stasis halted the progression for a time, a cure still eludes Lloyd's grasp. The Void withers the Cavia like it withers the surface of reality. With time running out, Lloyd makes one final attempt to save the Cavia and reverse the process of void decay. But the process fails. The smoldering hunger of the Void cannot be halted. The Cavia, at last, die. But the Void has one final trick. It raps upon the surface of the isolation chamber, a final message of mercy, or more likely, a sick punchline to the suffering that the Cavia endured. Regardless, like the Tenno, void-touched as the Cavia are, they are given another chance. The catalyzation of void and dust saves the Cavia, and they are wreathed in a psychoreactive halo that offers them a small fragment of the void's power, the ability to affect their will on reality. Though small is the critical word here, as their power manifests only as the ability to change color at their whim, at least so far. The small gift comes with the dissipation of their contamination, and the Cavia are allowed to live on unburdened by the slow death of the bell. Emboldened by their recovery, Fibonacci takes it upon himself to make a grand-scale effort in working against the Murmur by creating a network of Jahu gargoyles throughout the system, stationed on the Tenno dojos in the fringes beyond the outer terminus. By taking the same principles of using form to combat the non-form that is the Void, he hopes to detect any other small-scale incursions throughout the system and prevent them before they become gaping holes like the doorway on Deimos. However, Fibonacci made a fatal flaw with the network. His plan only anticipated incursions of egress, of the Murmur emerging out from within the Void and into the world of dust. He did not anticipate that something else would attempt to enter the gap that was already manifest on the border of the world of dust. The Angels of the Zeraman. The process to empower the Jahu gargoyle relies on the energies of the deep void, the curses that the fragmented ones manifest. By consuming them alerts the Void Angels, and they seek to undo the Jahu gargoyles before they can become fully empowered. Thus, the Tenno are dispatched to the labs once more, to draw further heralds of the deep from within the void, secure their curses, and repel the angels that would devour them instead. Here is a good place to explain the method the Tenno use to summon more heralds from the deep. The Vitrium, as their name implies, are the eyes that monitor the labs, but critically, they are suitable hosts for the Atropos serum that allows one to view multiple realities simultaneously, to gaze across all the threads of the strand of Kra at once. Being mindless amalgams of the gray strain, they are capable of enduring the process without going insane, and by triangulating and nullifying the disturbances they detect across the fibers on the strand, the Tenno are able to coalesce the feelers of the deep void into a single thread, which they then use to haul the heralds into the world of dust. The heralds, the fragmented ones, are all appropriately named with a religious theme. While many things in Warframe are often named for flavor first, it's still a fun bit of trivia. Interestingly, they are named specifically with the male counterpart of the title, likely given due to the fact that the Void encountered Albrecht first. Anchorite instead of Anchoress, Zealotor instead of Zealotrix. Suzerain is non-specific, and most likely named not for its modern definition, but for its archaic usage, denoting the superior ruler in the ancient biblical covenant who bestowed blessings onto their adherents, and curses upon those who opposed them. The religious nomenclature is fitting, giving their duties as heralds for the Grand Indifference, the eldritch god that follows in their wake. And speaking of the Indifference, once again it is important to bring up what it wants. The nature of its true desires remain as fragmented as its heralds, and as foreign as its origin. The Indifference clearly seeks to recover its severed finger and untether itself from the constraints of our reality, but it also seeks to gain access to the world of dust. Much like the man it copied, it plans for numerous contingencies, and the direct path through Deimos is only an alternative to what seems to be its primary goal, passage through the Tenno, a willing host to grant permission and allow its entry into the world of dust. But why is it so fervent on reaching our world? A likely reason is that, much like the Cavia it birthed, the sudden horror of becoming imprinted onto it a deep and unmendable wound, a desire to become more, to make up for all it never was by consuming all that ever will be. Tagfer even seems to think as much, though he assigns a much more innocent desire onto the Void, stating that it merely wants to be a part of our reality, and the cartoonish, exaggerated murmur are its attempts to mimic how it understands us, childish sketches brought into physical being. Our refusals of the Void, and our failing to make good upon the deal struck aboard the Zariman, have continued to infuriate the Indifference, and it seems that with the events on Deimos, it has had enough. In the epilogue of the quest, we see that the Void, embodying both our demon and Albrecht's, seeks next to attack the source of shelter and guidance for the Tenno, the Lotus. The feint against the Lotus aboard Pregasa was not enough to intimidate the Tenno into compliance, and the Void seeks to make good upon the threat. Only time will tell how next the Indifference will strike, and how the Tenno will work to tame the beast they bargained with. But before ending the video, I figure I might as well delve into some wild speculation regarding the nature of 1999 and how it relates to the rest of the Warframe timeline. Not what Albrecht plans to do there exactly, but the nature of the year itself. Admittedly, most of these will be scattershot theories and possibilities of varying plausibility, so if you were looking only for more direct explanations, then the remainder of the video may not be to your liking. Again, the exact method of how time travel works in the Warframe universe is brought into question. Lloyd explains the strands of Craw as conceptually embodied instances of cause and effect, and if the 1999 that Albrecht visits is also tied to that same logic, it would mean he is essentially traveling through the Void to a place that exists as a snapshot of 1999. From there, he seeks to change history by weaving a new thread from that starting point across the strand of Craw until reaching the moment he wishes to change, his encounter with the Indifference. Much like the Drifter was overwritten by the timeline we established when striking the bargain with the Void, Albrecht's goal may have consequences that are impossible to foresee. Though this assumes that Albrecht is in fact working backwards along the strand of Craw in adherence with eternalism, and not using some wholly different method of time travel that has yet to be established, so this may all be moot. With the rough goal and method established, it's also a good question to ask what 1999 is. Previously, Warframe has gone with the assumption that it exists in some far-flung future of our reality, with the history pre-Orokin being largely the same. But with the writing seen in 1999 being a form of low Orokin script, it may indicate that Warframe has an entirely alternative history compared to our own. Another potential is that the 1999 we see may be a moment in the Orokin Empire calendar that just so happened to have similar technology compared to our own year of 1999, but personally that seems a bit convenient and likely not the truth. Yet another potential is that, as Albrecht was the template by which the Void understands reality, it merely transposed Albrecht's knowledge backwards across the strand of Craw, turning certain objects and writing into rough comparisons from the perspective of a man living in the height of the Empire. Another point to bring up is the Great Plague. Previously, I'd believed that the Great Plague occurred at some point during the Old War, or shortly thereafter in the early years of the collapse, when Orokin technocyte projects had been left unattended and spread like wildfire throughout the system. Instead, it seems that the Great Plague took place long before, and the infestation was merely repurposed later by Ballas, as the Orokin turned towards the past for answers to the sentient threat, rather than a bioweapon originally designed as an attempt to defeat the sentients. While the placement of the Great Plague can fit with just about any interpretation of when 1999 is in relation to the Orokin Empire calendar, the easiest and cleanest solution is simply that Warframe is a completely different timeline from our own, and Loa Orokin was simply the written language of choice in this alternate reality. Admittedly, its exact nature isn't really all that important, but it would open up more possibilities for histories different to our own, rather than working with the assumption that everything in Warframe had the same established timeline up until our current era. But as with many things, this is mostly uncertain, and until we return to the Plague Year and come face to face with Albrecht and the Indifference once more, this is what we know.